Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm sure we're going to continue to have a few people coming in. It's a little bit of a challenging time to have a lecture, but we wanted to make sure that we had time for a reception to follow, so we're starting a little early. It's an absolute pleasure for me to welcome all of you here this evening, and it's so great to see so many familiar faces. I remember standing here when I first started only about 2.5 years ago and looking out and doing this introduction, and I didn't know anybody, and it feels way more friendly now. I really can recognize just about everybody in the room, so it feels so good. um, Over the years, the faculty of the landscape architecture department has had the absolute privilege of bringing remarkable speakers to this event, all in tribute to Edward D. Stone Jr., a trailblazer in landscape architecture and a global leader whose legacy continues to inspire our profession. Each year, in the spirit of Ed Stone's impact, our faculty selects speakers who are also leaders in their field. Tonight, we're thrilled to welcome Meg Calkins from NC State. But before we introduce Meg, we're taking this special 10th anniversary of the Ed Stone. Did you guys know it was the 10th anniversary? Isn't that fantastic? Now you do. I realized it about a week and a half ago. To celebrate another awardee, and this is going to be really special because it's the 2024 recipient of the Joshua W. Lepp Memorial Traveling Award. The award was established, this particular award was established by John and Catherine Anderson in partnership with Joshua's parents, Terry and Maxine uh, Schneidelbach. Terry was a professor emeritus, who many of you may know and remember, and also former chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture. He was a two-time Rome Prize recipient and an award-winning designer. The LEP Award was created to honor Joshua's memory in supporting students in transformative travel experiences that enrich their professional and personal lives. So tonight, we're proud to recognize this year's awardee, Jordan Friedlander. I first met Jordan during her capstone seminar in 2023 in the fall, where she selected what she described in her LEP application as a unique and spontaneous project. This experience profoundly shaped her landscape architectural interests, which was the basis of her application to travel on this prestigious award. Jordan is a double gator, going to be a double gator soon. She's currently earned her bachelor's of landscape architecture from the University of Florida in August 2024 and is now pursuing a master's degree in the Integrated Sustainable Development Program. Her passion for sustainable landscape architecture, community involvement, and public art is truly inspiring. She's a lead green associate and a member of ASLA. She's also the member of the UF student chapter of ASLA, the National Association of Minority Landscape Architects, and Lambda Sigma Alpha Honor Society. This evening, I want to just remind all of you that this uh, event was put together in conjunction with the University of sorry, the ASLA Florida's Gainesville chapter, and Compan is our sponsor. And afterwards, I invite you all to stay for a reception that's been partially funded by Compan, who's here tonight, and I hope you get a chance to speak to the Compan representative. Um, this evening, Jordan will share highlights from her travels, and then she will introduce our Ed Stone speaker. So please join me in welcoming Jordan Friedlander to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Brook. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how European cemeteries rest their deceased. Before I begin, I'd like to ask a question of how many of you would ever consider sightseeing cemeteries while you travel? Okay, nice representation. All right. So like Jules had mentioned, I wasn't always drawn to cemeteries. For my undergraduate capstone, I was paired with the cemetery for this project. This project provided me with the opportunity to work with community members and Jacksonville LISC to create a positive impact on the community. This cemetery held vital importance in an African American community, which was also home to U.S. veterans and political figures, among others. This project was a catalyst and an example to earn grants to revitalize the cemetery. Being a part of such an important project lit a fire inside me and sparked an interest in cemetery design. When I heard about the Joshua Lepp Travel Scholarship, I saw an opportunity to explore my newfound interest. I was selected for the award and I began my planning. I decided to take my mother along with me to share something with her that has become important to me. Today I will share that experience with all of you. Now let's take that trip together. When I began my initial research, I had architectural sculptures, landscapes, and art sculptures as a part of my studies, which is included along the list of the sides of the screen. Today I want to focus on the cemeteries. Tampa International had recently announced that they were providing direct flights to Amsterdam, so my first location had been picked. I knew I wanted to go to Paris and that the train system would make for the most efficient means of travel. So I began to look up places in Belgium and found monumental exhibits in Brussels. So culture, art, and time were driving factors for the cemetery's environment. Religion, politics, and social class influenced culture. Many of the cemeteries that we had visited there were several different religious symbols. There was no clear denomination of which religion the cemetery could be if you were where you could be buried. It was everybody. Politics influenced the rules and regulations. For example, Paris has gone through emperors and kings, while in the United States we have a president, which I'll get into as we move forward. Social class is apparent in extravagance of the resting places. And then looking at art in the cemetery, it's influenced by evolution, landscape, and tradition. Paris, for example, has been through all of the famous art movements from the Baroque to the Renaissance to modernism. Landscape affects the feel of the space, the species of trees that are picked, the colors that are being seen in the cemeteries all give a thematic feel to what you're experiencing. Tradition is repeated from old graves to new, so in some of the active cemeteries there were new burials, but it wasn't like they stuck out. They blended right in with the artwork and the different cultural symbols that were included. And then time is very important in development. Paris is over 2,000 years old, Brussels is over 1,000 years old, and just this year we're 249 years old. Historical factors like wars and revolutions and political careers influence the culture of the cemeteries. And of course, beliefs of cemetery importance or generational changes. For example, the way I believe the importance of cemeteries is going to be way different than my grandparents and their parents beforehand. So the first cemetery I visited was the New Ooster in Amsterdam. It is a whopping 82 acres and the largest cemetery in Amsterdam. It also has the largest collection of trees in Amsterdam with over 900 species. I had never seen grave markers like this before. The markers are made of all different kinds of materials and all different kinds of art forms. The intricate sculptures are a statement piece that have resembled the life the person could have lived. You can see here they're made out of quartz, glass, and a lot of different subjective art pieces. The New Ooster had many features resembling a memorial park. This made me want to stay in the cemetery and just sit down and kind of absorb what was around me rather than just walking from point A to point B to get somewhere, even though I had no family buried here. There was a columbarium, which is, if you're not familiar, it's basically a wall that has cutouts in it. It's for more of a non-permanent factor that you put urns in so you can take them and put them back or do whatever you feel is necessary. There was a water feature which was very interesting to see in the cemetery, and being there in winter as the leaves fall and just gently rested on the water it just created a view and an experience that I have not seen before. I decided to include the Anne Frank House because I believe it to be the exact definition of memory, which is the purpose of a cemetery. Although it's not directly a cemetery, millions of people travel all over the world to come and learn or experience what it may have been like for Anne and her family. Something that really stuck with me that was said in the house was that Anne always wanted to become a famous writer, and by publishing her story, she became one. And after hearing this and then walking through the house, it kind of framed my emotional experience walking through it. and I believe that that is very important when designing an environment for a cemetery. Laeken Cemetery in Brussels was my favorite cemetery I visited. It's over 200 years old and it's 15 acres. Laeken is the oldest cemetery in Brussels and it is still active. You may recognize this statue here, which is called the Thinker. It was designed by Auguste Rodin, and it is an original bronze cast statue, one of 27 other around the world. This other image to the right is a sculpture of a woman inside of a mausoleum, and she is reaching upward, which was commissioned by her husband, and there's a cutout in the roof of the mausoleum that's in the shape of a heart. So when the sun's at its highest point in June, it shines through the roof into the shape of a heart, and the sculpture is reaching up to it as if she was reaching for her love. The type of art in this cemetery was very romantic and dark Gothic. It is what you would think a spooky cemetery would look like. Underneath the cemetery, there was a crypt with over 4,000 graves, which is this image here. And if you've ever been to a storage unit, this is exactly what it felt like. It just went on forever, and you didn't want to walk too far because there was no electricity, there was no lights, only these cutouts in the ground that had glass plates through them, allowing natural light to illuminate the space underground. By the entrance to the crypt was a huge columbarium, which is this back wall here. And the new addition to the cemetery, which can be seen in this image down here, is for new active burials, and instead of using headstones and markers, they placed plants and flowers on the graves, and you could cut the flowers and the plants from the graves and lay them on a grave that you were visiting. So if you didn't bring anything, you could grab something from this existing cemetery and put it somewhere else. And this church on the upper right-hand corner is Our Lady Laeken. It's the Laeken Royal Family Church, and there's several royalty members rested underneath the church. Père-Lachaise Cemetery is the largest cemetery in Paris at 110 acres with over 1 million people buried there, and it is the most visited cemetery in the world. At the front of the cemetery, there's a church and a crematorium, which is that big Gothic building in that central area. It's encased by a 2-story columbarium on all sides, and beneath the entire area, there's a crypt like the one at Laeken. There were many famous people buried at Père-Lachaise, like Frédéric Chopin, Jean de La Fontaine, and of course Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors. Among others, Oscar Wilde and James Monroe, the 5th president of the United States. And as a classical violinist, being able to visit Frédéric Chopin's grave and seeing that his work, over 200 years old, is still prominent, it was a very important and valuable experience to me. And these images encapsulate the feel of the cemetery, the crazy terrain that was almost like walking up and down a mountain on very old cobblestone pathways. You had to watch where you were walking or you were for sure to face plant. And yeah, they framed beautiful views. You can see that some of the structures and monuments were over 20 feet high. And then of course, when planning cemeteries to visit, I had to go to the Paris catacombs before descending down the 243 steps down a spiral staircase, 5 stories underground. My mother and I were a little uncomfortable. Once we got to the bottom and walked through and made the journey under the catacombs, it proved to be the highlight of the trip. And in 1785, the city of Paris was exposed to famine and disease, which at the time was believed the source to be the cemeteries. The graves of 6 million people were exhumed and the bones were dumped into the tunnels under Paris. After some time, the project was commissioned by an artist to revitalize what was there, to make it of something more respectful and even something for the public to experience. So as you can see in this image, it was mostly skulls and femurs on the front side of the facade, and all the rest of the bones were packed behind this wall. You can see here that a lot of the different skulls were put in shapes like before was the heart, there's a cross, and many more things with other artwork and plaques embedded. And most of these plaques were in French or Latin. So this one translates to, so everything happens on earth. Spirit, beauty, graces talent, such as an ephemeral flower. Let the slightest wind blow over. Mount Parnasse is the 2nd largest cemetery in Paris at 47 acres. It was installed on the previous site of 3 large farms. the designer of the Statue of Liberty, and the inventor of the gas lamp are buried here. You can see here there's a lot of different types of graves. You can observe religious symbols and different materials and still having the consistent artwork throughout the cemetery rather than, just having a traditional rectangular plaque that's just put there with a name. There's artwork and different subjective feelings associated with these markings. Pathways guide the visitors through the cemetery grounds and they frame views. There is a commonality between religious symbols and mausoleum structures throughout the cemetery. Something I found interesting was how people use the cemetery to cut through the city to get where they need to go. The cemetery effortlessly became a part of the city, and many of the civilians' routes for their everyday travels, whether they were going to the grocery store, they were going to work, it just became a means of travel to walk through the cemetery. Montmartre is the third largest cemetery in Paris, covering 26 acres, and during the French Revolution, it was used as a mass grave for victims who had fallen. Montmartre is home to 50 stray cats, and when we visited this cemetery specifically, it was on Friday the 13th, so we were walking around and you could see the black cats all creeping around the headstones and stuff, and there was also crows everywhere just chirping up a storm. It was an experience like no other. And this cemetery I found to be very captivating due to its location. You can see that there's a bridge that slices right through the cemetery for vehicles and pedestrians above there. And the cemetery was also terraced. On each level, there were burials. So it wasn't a flat site. You can see that it steps down 3 levels, and down here you can see the terraced. And of course, it also had some of the most beautiful mausoleums and grave markers that we saw throughout the entire trip. Like the inside of this red mausoleum is this mosaicked piece of Jesus, and this is also a steel, what I think to be a tree, and it has personal items and bird feeders hanging from it. I have an image of Jacksonville Memorial and Montmartre in Paris. And so they have several things in common, although they may not look very similar. For example, different kinds of grave markers and not keeping everybody with the same representation. Art personifies the life lived by the deceased, so different kinds of markers can exemplify the kind of life or the beliefs that they had when they were alive. And of course, the different specimen trees that you can see, for example, the live oak, it adds a lot of character to the cemetery. But is it sustainable? Conventional burial practice contributes to climate change and irresponsible consumption of non-renewable resources. One cremation releases 535 pounds of carbon, which is equivalent to a 600-mile car ride. 1.6 million tons of concrete are used in cemeteries yearly in the United States. The consumption of urban land use to build cemeteries prevents future land use, and 30 million board feet of wood is used to build caskets yearly in the US, which could build 4.5 million houses. Over 104,000 tons of steel is used to make caskets yearly, and groundwater contamination is possible due to chemicals from the caskets, pesticides from lawn care, decomposition, and embalming fluids. 4 million gallons of formaldehyde is used in the US yearly for embalming processes. And over time, the heavy caskets can cause destabilization in the soil, and with the karst geology of Gainesville, sinkholes. We can prevent these negative reactions by pushing for green burials. Green burials use no pesticides on the lawn, no toxic embalming fluids, and they utilize biodegradable caskets that do not leave a permanent footprint. Cardboard, linen, or cotton shrouds, wicker or woven caskets, and untreated wood are acceptable options. Grave markers could be smaller and made of natural elements, or even replacing it with a tree or a plant, like those trees that have ribbons around them signifying memoriam or importance. Cemeteries need to be green. They need to have a lot of trees and plants, color. They need to use native plants for the area. If we're speaking for Florida, Florida friendly, to minimize the water usage and the thrivability of the plants so there's less maintenance and contribute to the feel of Florida. Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery is one of the only certified green cemeteries in the state of Florida. It is located in Gainesville, and if you've never been, I highly recommend you visit. The Conservation Cemetery alone sequesters 115 tons of carbon yearly, and in 2023 prevented the use of 7.7 tons of steel, 77 tons of concrete, and 616 gallons of embalming fluid. I will leave you with one last thought. How can we collectively change the perspectives of conventional cemetery practices to more sustainable green practices? You decide. And so, oh. Meg Calkins is a fellow of CELA and ASLA Florida. She is a professor of landscape architecture and environmental planning at North Carolina State University. She holds a Master of Landscape Architecture and a Master of Architecture from the University of California at Berkeley, and has taught and written about resilient site design and sustainable construction for over 25 years. Meg is also the author of Materials for Sustainable Sites and editor of the Sustainable Sites Handbook. She has taken an active leadership role in development and implementation of the Sustainable Sites Initiative since 2003. Meg's current book is Details and Materials for Resilient Sites, a climate-positive approach. It will be published by Routledge in May 2025. Meg received a Landscape Architecture Foundation Fellowship for Leadership and Innovation, where she developed key themes for this book. She currently serves on the Landscape Architecture Foundation Board of Directors. If you would all please join me in welcoming Meg Calkins.
Thank you. Thank you, Jordan. That was a kind introduction. I wonder if this is on. Oh well. Everybody can hear me okay. Good. Alrighty. Well, I am so thrilled to be here. And I'm seeing many familiar faces in the audience because I've met a lot of students today, and it's great to see you all here. I want to share my recent work with the hope that together we can facilitate substantive change in the site construction industry. First off, can I see a show of hands of anybody who is outside the field of landscape architecture? All righty, good, a few folks. So, good, are you, anybody in the construction industry? Good, couple, all righty. So, I love materials. How many of you love materials, construction materials? Yeah, right. Wood, brick, tactile materials. I think they have such a great influence on the feeling of a place. And there's so many design opportunities with putting materials together into assemblies. But I have, over the years, become very concerned about the environmental impacts that materials have, and more recently, the human health impacts that they pose and the human equity impacts that they pose. I've really grown increasingly concerned ever since I wrote my first article back in 1999 about the embodied energy of cement. This was really before we were even talking about embodied carbon. We were talking about the amount of energy it takes to make cement. Now we know that that energy leads to release of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to talk to you today about why we need to make a substantial shift in the materials industry, why we need to work toward a climate positive approach to materials and details for resilient sites. In 2015, all independent nations in the world signed the Paris Agreement. And this was to, quote, hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2050. Unfortunately, it's not 2050, it's now. This past year, 2024, was the first year that we crossed the 1.5 degree threshold and actually had a 1.6 degree Celsius increase above pre-industrial levels. And you can see from this chart, actually you can't see my cursor, so I need to use the pointer. You can see from this chart that really for the past 6 years, we've been up around 1.3, 1.4 degrees Celsius. So I'm very, very concerned. And I just want to go on record as saying that climate change is an urgent problem that we need to address. And the beauty is that we as landscape architects or builders or architects can address that problem, and there's a lot of ways. But I'm very fearful that the increasingly destructive impacts from storms, fires, and intense heat are going to affect more and more people. They're already affecting many people in the state of Florida. Perhaps more worrisome is the biodiversity loss that is increasingly caused by climate change. These charts show biodiversity loss between 1970 and 2016. During that time, Latin America and the Caribbean saw a 94% biodiversity loss. Africa, 65% in the space of 35 years. It's very worrisome, and even more worrisome is that this is negatively affecting our food supply. So our good news is that our profession recognizes that climate change is a crisis, and in 2022, the Climate Action Plan was released by ASLA. I had the good fortune of working on this. And in fact, I just signed on as chair of the task force to revise the plan for 2025. It'll be released at the ASLA conference in New Orleans this year. And it's actually going to be a climate and biodiversity action plan, recognizing that the two go hand in hand, and we as designers really can influence both of those issues. But the plan sets forth multiple goals, but the most key and probably the hardest to achieve is to achieve zero embodied carbon and operational emissions and increase carbon sequestration by 2040. So if you are familiar with embodied carbon and the huge footprint of building our sites and building our buildings, you'll know that that's a really tall order. But I'm going to tell you what this means. This essentially means this zero embodied and operational emissions means that all of the CO2 and other greenhouse gases that are released to produce materials are added to all of the CO2 emissions from maintaining landscapes, like mowing them or lighting them or powering the irrigation controllers. All of these things are added together, and then they're offset by sequestering carbon in the landscape. And that, of course, can be done by trees, shrubs, any other plants, and even non-living things like wood lumber. But this is a very, very tall order because 80 to 90% of the embodied carbon of a built landscape comes from the materials used to build it. What this means, this is a showing life cycle of materials from the raw material acquisition phase, transportation to the factory, manufacturing, and of course there's often multiple steps to manufacturing, transportation to the site, and construction. All of this, and then all of the end of life stages, deconstruction, demolition, transport to waste disposal, etc. All of that is 80 to 90%, and only 10 to 20% is what we call operating carbon from maintaining the site and powering the site and that kind of thing. So what this means is that we have to substantially change our site construction materials, material specs, and detail assemblies to reduce their carbon footprints. That is the only way. This making a radical shift is the only way that we're going to meet the ASLA climate action goal of zero embodied carbon and operating carbon emissions by 2040. So what does this mean for construction materials? I'm going to pick on concrete for a little while. I love concrete, don't get me wrong. It's a great material. We're always going to use it, but we can use it a little bit better. So this is a concrete parking lot, right? This is a parking space. We know how big that is, 9 by 18, right? But here is its carbon footprint in terms of volume of carbon. 10 meters across is the volume of 1 ton of carbon, which is about what would be released to build that parking space. So you can see that construction materials have this huge footprint, but we can make it better. And I'm going to talk to you about concrete in just a minute. First, I want to show you something, and this is the first time I've shown this publicly. This is the cover of my new book. I just settled on the image like 3 days ago. My publisher emailed me and said, you have to decide. And so finally I decided on this image, partly because it encompasses so many of the themes in the book. But I wrote this book because I feel like if we're going to make this substantial shift, I need to provide information to landscape architects on how to do it. And there's a lot, it's hard to make the shift. It's hard enough to make the shift without having information about embodied carbon and other trade-offs that we need to make. This particular project is Warsaw Uprising Mound Park. It's in Warsaw, Poland. It just won the prize for European Public Space, or the European Prize for Public Space, I guess is what it's called. It's built on top of a huge mound of debris from World War II. Warsaw was incredibly bombed. Those of you who know your history know that Warsaw was one of the hardest hit cities in Europe. So they dragged all this debris out of the city and they just piled it up 35 meters high. It's an incredibly high mound. But over the 75 years that it's just been sitting there, soil has deposited, plants have grown, and all of a sudden it's just a really big hill outside the city, and someone planted a sculpture on the top and said, this is Warsaw Uprising. We're coming back. But then they decided to make it into a park, and they have featured a lot of the rubble in some gabions. They've featured it in the walls. In this case, they've hand-packed these concrete and soil walls, revealing some of the artifacts, and also trying to return even the walls of the park, the retaining walls, back to the land. In this case, this guy is spraying moss spores all over the wall, and over time, moss is growing in. So it's a really beautiful, poetic project that I'm really pleased to feature on the cover of the book. So let me tell you a little bit more about the book. I'm talking about decarbonizing construction materials, because climate change is the most urgent issue of our time. But I'm also talking about the circular economy, reusing materials, reusing structures in place. The book addresses human health issues of producing construction materials, as well as social equity issues, because in some international construction materials industries, there's forced labor, mining and manufacturing the materials. In fact, as Jordan was talking about the cemeteries, I was thinking, boy, wasn't it great that they all used local stone? Now we don't. We harvest the granite in India, it gets carved in China. The granite harvesting in India can include harvesting by forced laborers and even child laborers. It gets sent to China to be carved and worked and shaped, and then it gets sent to the US. So the footprint of that is tremendous, as well as the human cost. So I'm talking about all the basic materials like concrete, brick, earth-based materials, stone and aggregates, plastics, metals, wood, ways to improve them. I'm acknowledging that we're always going to use concrete, right? We can't get rid of it. And nor should we, because it's actually a pretty good material, but we can make it better. I'm also looking at structures and assemblies. So dense pavements, porous pavements, embankments, and retaining walls. And I just realized that some of my slides are being cut off because under the retaining walls is decks, fences, and gates. So that's what it says on the bottom there. It's all right, they're not being cut off very much. Anyway, that's kind of the extent of the book, and these are the types of projects that I'm highlighting in the book as relatively low carbon, innovative, but still compelling and beautiful projects. That's a really key consideration, is that we not compromise our design or our aesthetics for this, but we do need to do it. So we're not going to get to net zero carbon with just one solution. There are a multitude of solutions that we can employ, and I'm going to talk about those today. I'm going to start with the first solution, which is to reduce the embodied carbon of standard construction materials. And this will happen with a lot of players. It'll happen with the materials industry, the suppliers, the distributors, the product manufacturers. Many of them are setting plans for net zero carbon. And so they're really taking legit steps, which I'll talk about in the concrete industry, toward reducing the embodied carbon of the production of the material. But it's also going to be on the designers and the engineers to use lower carbon mixes. And we can do that, but it's going to also involve a lot of collaboration. So why am I picking on concrete? Well, I'm picking on concrete because the global cement and concrete industry is responsible for 7 to 8% of our global emissions each year. 7 to 8%, one construction material. So that's pretty crazy. You remember the parking space, right? So that's a big deal. And this diagram is one of the diagrams from the book. It shows the life cycle of concrete, from raw material extraction to cement production to concrete mixing, transportation, use. And the good news for concrete is that it is regularly reused, most commonly as recycled concrete aggregate. It gets crushed up and used as base aggregate or used as aggregate in new asphalt mixes or new concrete mixes. But it also can be reused whole as slabs for paving, which I'll show you in just a minute. That's all great news. The really poor news is the cement production. Essentially, cement is about 10% of a concrete mix, but it's about 90% of the carbon footprint of concrete. So we have to do something here. This is the place to intervene in this system. And it's not as easy to intervene as we think. 40% of the CO2 that's released from the production of cement comes from the fossil fuel combustion to heat the kilns and that kind of thing. But 60% comes from what's called process emissions, where the carbon is released from transforming limestone into Portland cement clinker. So those process emissions are really hard to eliminate. So my solution that I would like to strongly recommend is that we start to move away from Portland cement, because there's alternatives to Portland cement, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the industry itself has this plan, and they're going to get to net zero by 2050. The first point of the plan is really in our hands, and that's to optimize design, to build smaller, more efficient structures, to use the lowest strength concrete for the use. So there's a tendency to say, all right, everything on the site is going to be 4,000 PSI because the building is. So we're only going to bring one truck to the site. We're just going to use 4,000 PSI. You're using about 15% more cement than you need to be using. That's more expensive, but it's also much higher embodied carbon. So using the right strength for the use, and then designing for durability. In some cases, what this means is using sulfate-resistant concrete mixes so that the structure can last a good long time. The next approach is to use cement substitutes. You've heard of fly ash being used as a cement substitute. Now calcined clay is actually a naturally occurring material that occurs all over the world that's increasingly used in concrete mixes. Ground limestone in small amounts is used in many, many concrete mixes. So there are ways to use cement substitutes, but the ones that I have the most hope for are actually the alternative cements. These are alternative cements that don't use any Portland cement at all, but instead they use alternative chemistries and alternative constituents. How many of you know that carbon gets captured and sequestered in concrete? All right, just a couple people, yeah. So the industry is counting on this for a 45% reduction. So the industry is counting on kind of a new technologies to get us to zero. I'm a little uncomfortable with this. I mean, there's great technologies out there. You can actually cure concrete with carbon instead of water. You can mix carbon and mineral filler and let it solidify and use it as aggregate, carbon aggregate, which is what's shown in that picture. You can grind it up and use it as a new kind of cement. There's a lot of ways that you can sequester carbon in concrete, but they're all new technologies. And so I do worry that maybe this isn't going to get us there. A really simple one, though, is renewable energy. If it was a little more simple, we'd be in a better place. But, but Europe is really leading the way with this. And a lot of countries have moved, or will have moved completely away from fossil fuels within a decade. And I think we can follow. So that could be a good way to reduce the embodied carbon of cement and concrete. But then there's also, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, I've heard of biogenic limestone grown by algae and cement made from calcium silicate instead of from limestone. There's a lot of concrete innovations out there, a lot of stuff that gives us a lot of hope. And the magazines like Fast Company and Dwell love to feature these products. But the challenge is that they are a cost premium. And they're in specialized niche applications right now. So it's going to take a couple decades to really scale all this up to be widespread use. All right, so the next approach is to use alternative materials and structures. And from this, I mean flexible structures. For instance, asphalt, it has its own heat island issues, but asphalt is a flexible structure, asphalt pavement, and it can be resurfaced, it can be repaired, it can be surfaced in such a way that it doesn't perform poorly with heat islands. And if it settles a little bit, it can be repaired. What happens when concrete settles a little bit? It's done for, right? It cracks. And cracks, little cracks are okay, big cracks are not okay. And over time, it gets replaced before it needs to be. Using local materials and methods and nature-based structures are other approaches. So in the book, I crunch a lot of embodied carbon numbers. Remember, this is embodied carbon across the entire life cycle. And in this particular study, I took a lot of different structures, pavements, retaining walls, seat walls, decks, fences, guardrails, et cetera, and I compare embodied carbon for different alternatives. Everything from very standard, oops, what did I just do? Very standard assemblies like an imported granite veneer on concrete retaining wall or a poured in place concrete retaining wall, to alternative structures like compressed earth block or cement slabs in a gabion wall or a living crib wall. These are all alternative structures. And I totaled the embodied carbon for a 10-meter long stretch of each of these walls. And here's my results. The imported granite veneer is literally off the charts, right? It is 3 tons of CO2 equivalents for a 10-meter stretch of wall, which is kind of, when I finally totaled everything, that made me feel a little sick, how much carbon gets released from that little wall. The poured-in-place concrete wall isn't great either. It's not quite as bad. The compressed earth block wall, which is essentially a mix of soil, can be very local soil, and a little bit of cement, maybe 5% of cement, and water, and compressed pneumatically at very high pressure, and it becomes kind of like concrete blocks. This does better, right? Less than a ton of carbon for a 10-meter stretch of wall. The stainless steel gabions with reclaimed concrete do well also, as does the vegetated crib wall. But this isn't the whole story. We need to make trade-offs because we're not going to stop using granite veneer. We're not going to stop using concrete, right? What we're going to do is we're going to use domestically sourced granite, and we're going to reduce the embodied carbon by 25%. If we use cement substitutes for 50%. Oops, oh my gosh. Okay, sorry about that, guys. I'm trying to get to my notes. If we use cement substitutes for 50% of the cement, it reduces the carbon footprint by an additional percentage, and then reducing the thickness of the wall will get us down to 43%. So we're close to cutting the embodied carbon of this in half just with these trade-offs, and going from a 12-inch thick wall to a 9-inch thick wall structurally is not going to be a problem for a retaining wall of this height, right? So same thing with the concrete. Just taking it from 4,000 psi to 3,000 psi, we've just cut off 15% of the embodied carbon. Using cement substitutes, we're down to 34%. And then reducing the thickness of the wall, you've reduced the whole carbon footprint by 47%. So these are some substantive changes for not really big changes. They're not affecting the appearance of the wall at all. And they're not really outlandish changes. Sizing down isn't a big deal. Probably the most outlandish is using 50% cement substitutes. That's still kind of hard to do, but we're getting there for sure. Same thing with the compressed earth block wall using 50% cement substitutes. But here's the rub with our living structure. It's going to store 3 tons of carbon over its lifetime. But with the plants growing, the wood from the crib wall does store a little bit of carbon until it decomposes, but the plants on that wall are going to store 3 tons of carbon. And so I would ask, why can't we do a living crib wall in downtown Gainesville? Or why can't we do it on the University of Florida campus? It doesn't need to be a national park or state park type structure. I think it can be an urban structure if we can adjust our aesthetic expectations. Plus, the message from this is that we can make substantive change with standard materials also. So in a few minutes, I'm going to tell you that we need to move toward bio-based construction materials to the extent possible. So I thought I would do a quick study of deck boards, of decking. And so I selected some common decking that we would use, and probably you would use as well: pressure-treated pine, thermally modified ash or some other thermally modified hardwood, tropical hardwood. I chose Ipe because that's a pretty common one, although becoming less common because we're using it up. Fused bamboo lumber, which is a composite bamboo product, and then a composite plastic lumber. And you'll see these replacement factors. What this means is that over the 30-year life of a deck, we're going to have to replace the pressure-treated lumber probably 1.5 or 2.5 times, right? So we're going to initially install it, and then every 10 to 15 years, we're going to replace it. Some of these other alternatives have no replacement factor, like the fused bamboo lumber or the tropical hardwood. So when you're doing embodied carbon calculations, you have to factor that in, right? We have to understand the full life cycle of our structure. And this is what I found. It was interesting. The embodied carbon is all pretty similar for this 9x12 deck, not huge differences. And this is factoring in the replacement factor. Of course, the wood plastic composite is again off the chart, but you could make a case for using it because it's incredibly durable and it uses waste wood as well as waste plastic. So it does have higher embodied energy, but it has some good it performs well, as you'll see in the next couple slides. Something to think about with wood products is carbon stored, and how much carbon can be stored by this product, because wood stores carbon after it's harvested, not all the carbon that the tree was sequestering, but until it is burned or breaks down, it'll store carbon. So we can start to think, if the wood is sustainably harvested or certified, and new trees are planted right after the old ones are harvested, it can be a carbon neutral material. But this is under discussion right now, so stay tuned as to what our field is saying and what the architecture field is saying about this. But anyway, carbon storage is definitely a feature of this. But I think the most important consideration is the ecosystem impacts. So our first two choices, pressure-treated pine and thermally modified ash, both of these woods are grown in the US, oftentimes grown regionally. They're processed regionally, and you can get certified lumber. So you know that it's been sustainably harvested. So the ecosystem impacts are, in the low range. The tropical hardwood in this case is off the chart, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But the ecosystem impacts of these are relatively low, particularly the wood plastic composite. This does not show, the embodied carbon doesn't show transportation impacts. And the fused bamboo is made in China and shipped over here. The ipe is harvested in Brazil and shipped here. So there are substantial transportation impacts there. But here's a discussion of the ecosystem impacts. Because ipe doesn't occur, it's not super prevalent. There's like one ipe tree every 5 acres or so in a forest. It would take us 1.6 acres of rainforest to yield the lumber for one deck. And studies show that after the logging of a keystone tree, the ecosystem around it will decline and become pasture land within 5 years. So we're going to lose 1.6 acres of rainforest. And that's going to give us a loss of 25 tons of CO2 absorption each year. So there's the carbon footprint, but then there's also the loss of the ecosystem and the carbon footprint of that as well, that I think a lot of times we don't factor into our studies. But most shocking is the human rights abuses that happen, not just with ipe, but with other tropical hardwoods as well. But this situation is well documented. Over 20 years, the Pastoral Land Commission in the Para State of Brazil documented over 1,700 deaths from land disputes in the Amazon, most of which were related to illegal logging. You can see here, these are logging areas in yellow, and these are all of the land dispute deaths that occurred. So they're completely related to each other. And this is, in my opinion, this is not worth using tropical hardwood lumber. So while many of these other lumbers are fairly equal, we really need to avoid the tropical hardwoods wherever we can. And the good news is that there are many good alternatives now out there that can be used instead of tropical hardwoods. Okay, the last area that I want to talk about is consumption. Since 2020, the anthropomass, the mass embodied in our built environment, has exceeded the biomass on our planet. In other words, we've mined, harvested, drilled, excavated more materials than all of the biomass on Earth. And we keep doing it. So we need to decrease our resource, sorry about that. We need to decrease our resource consumption through engaging in the circular economy and through optimizing structures. Right now, we operate within a linear economy, mostly, where we excavate raw materials, we produce things, we use them, and then we throw them away. Sometimes we're in the re-economy, where we take raw materials, produce them, use them, waste, send them to waste, but we recycle some things. So we're okay, but we need to get to here, where waste from one structure or process or system is food for another, where we really have no waste. And the beauty is we have a great opportunity to do this, because 64% of the waste in our country is demolition debris. And we can take a building like this and we can crush it up and use it in concrete, we can use it in asphalt, we can use the waste in bricks. But even better is if we don't take the building down, we reuse the building, we rehab the building, or we don't take out the runway from an airport that has been decommissioned. Instead, we turn the runway into a running path or into a path within a park. This is a Sasaki Associates park in Shanghai, where they literally kept the runway in place. Where they couldn't keep it in place, they took slabs of it and replaced it. It replaced the slabs. But all the material for the pavement was obtained and reused right there on site. Another great example of this is from Wagon Landscaping. Has anybody heard of Wagon Landscaping? Good. So if you're interested in these topics, look up Wagon because they do some beautiful work with reclaimed materials. In this case, they took an asphalt parking lot and they saw cut it, removed it, rehabbed the soil a little bit, and planted it to make a temporary park. It's not a permanent park, but it's a temporary park that's just, very simple, very straightforward, but they do some very beautiful work. This is the last steel mill in Pittsburgh city center. It was transformed into a mixed-use center with shops, restaurants, offices. The entire structure of the building was maintained. Some new structures were inserted in it, but the entire landscape was built from waste materials on the site. And this was the other image that I was considering for the cover of my book. I ended up deciding that it was a little too busy for the cover, and so but every time I look at it, I go, oh, maybe I should have used that. But anyway, it's a very beautiful landscape that is built entirely from the waste on the site. So these beautiful concrete steps down into the garden from the passageway are giant slabs of concrete that were saw cut and placed just beautifully like a patchwork quilt. The retaining walls are old beams from the building, and Jersey barriers are used as benches. I think it's just a beautiful illustration of the circular economy. But within resource conservation, we can also just build smaller structures. So one day I said, hey, wouldn't it be fun to see what the difference in embodied carbon between a standard US parking lot and a European standard parking lot would be? And it's quite substantial. A 60-space parking lot in the US built to our typical standards of the 9x18 bays with a 24-foot drive aisle. For 60 spaces, we're releasing 97.81 tons of CO2 equivalents. We can reduce the footprint a bit by using 50% compact spaces, 50% standard spaces. But if we design our parking lot to European standards, all of a sudden we have 25% less cost and 25% less embodied carbon. At a simpler scale, just really simple decisions between the post for a deck. Structurally, if we can use a 4x4, we should use a 4x4 because we're using 56% less wood. It's a substantial difference. And of course, cost. The lovely thing is that cost can go along with this. All right, so I just want to end by talking about some shifts. And these would be major changes. You could call them shifts, if you will, that we need to work toward. And I like to think of these as the next practices for our profession. The first we're already doing, right? We're doing nature-based solutions, and this is a well-accepted approach to landscape architecture at this point. Even the UN is all over nature-based solutions, and the best part of it is that landscape architects are really at the center of all this, right? So they provide ecosystem services of flood mitigation, air pollution reduction, water quality improvements, carbon sequestration, etc. But I believe we can use nature-based solutions to build landscapes. We can use them for materials and details, as well as using them in the more typical way. So I think we can use nature-based solutions for construction materials. We can move more toward wood materials. There's a lot of great options out there that I showed you with the alternatives to tropical hardwood. We can use rapidly renewable materials. This is actually a bamboo structure at a park by field operations in Taupo. We can use blocks for walls that are grown by mycelium, which is a sort of a root tentacle of mushrooms. There's a lot of bio-based materials out there that are coming on the market that we really could be focusing on, but we can also focus on nature-based solutions for structures. We can build living fences. We can build living crib walls. We can use living block walls. We can 3D print earthen walls or use compressed earth block or rapidly renewable materials for these structures. But what this is going to mean is that our landscapes are going to look different. There's going to be an aesthetic shift, which is another major change. Some of you may remember back in the 90s when everybody started using native plants. And people said, oh, you can't have native plants in your front yard. They're too weedy looking. They're too fuzzy and, whatever you want to call them. They're messy looking, instead of prim little boxwood or trimmed azaleas or something like that. Got nothing against either one of those plants, but they're not native plants to the US. But over time, people came to love native plants, and there was an aesthetic shift in our profession that I think we could make again in this way. So I decided to take a really iconic landscape, the Dallas Museum of Art Sculpture Garden, designed by Dan Kiley, who is one of my personal heroes, and Edward Larrabee Barnes, and sort of say, all right, well, here are the materials of this landscape. It's limestone veneer on concrete. And of course, it's limestone in Texas, so that's already a fairly local material. But the seat walls were also limestone veneer on concrete. The pavement is cast stone pavement, which incidentally has an even higher embodied carbon than concrete. It is a form of concrete, but it uses more cement. Can we take these materials and can we reduce the embodied carbon of these materials? So this is what I did. Actually, my student did this. This is a rendering showing gabion walls with reclaimed concrete slabs instead of our limestone veneer. These are Texas limestone quarry block walls, very low embodied carbon because they're a local material. They're also a relatively unprocessed material. Stabilized stone dust pavement, which is more commonly known by a lot of folks as DG, and living fences. So when I crunch the numbers for all this, like I said, I've been crunching a lot of numbers the last year, there's an 83% reduction in embodied carbon for this. And I would argue that, yeah, this looks different than the Kiley landscape, right? But it doesn't look that different that it matters that much. And the benefit is also a 66% cost reduction. So yeah, you have to maintain the DG pavement, you have to maintain the living fences. Maybe there's more maintenance here, but not enough to offset that 66% cost reduction, right? So that's really important, aesthetics and the aesthetic shift. I hope I live for another 40 years so I can see that aesthetic shift happen, because it has to happen. Embodied carbon matters, right? We've already looked at this and seen all the trade-offs, but I do want to reemphasize that I'm not saying don't use concrete. I'm saying specify concrete differently. And the way that we know embodied carbon, well, my book has a lot of embodied carbon figures in it, but that's kind of a moving target, because embodied carbon of materials and products changes as our production technologies become more energy efficient, as we start to use alternative sources of energy. All of that will change the embodied carbon. But we can find out embodied carbon from environmental product declarations, which a lot of manufacturers of products in architecture will do embodied carbon declaration, environmental product declarations for their materials every 5 years or so. In landscape architecture, we need to start asking for this. We need to ask for these EPDs so that we can make intelligent choices about materials and products. And I just want to show you this comparison. How many of you have used the Pathfinder carbon calculator? All right, just a couple of you. So all the students in the room, my students have to use it to calculate the years to climate positive of their design project in a particular studio. So you all should do this. Pathfinder is a pretty user-friendly calculator. You put in the number of trees, you put in the existing trees, proposed trees, shrubs, grasses, etc. You put in the type of pavement you're going to use, the paving materials, the quantities of that. And the carbon calculator will tell you that your landscape, as designed like this, is going to take 194 years to be climate positive. Do you think a landscape like this will be there in 194 years? No, right? So that's a problem. But if you do things like convert 20% of the concrete to planting beds, using cement substitutes for the concrete, adding 14 trees, changing some of the site walls to wood instead of concrete, using stone dust pavement for some of the areas where people are sitting, not where they're walking, but where they're sitting. All of a sudden, you get to 20 years to climate positive, which is a much more reasonable goal. And that's something that can meet the ASLA Climate Action Plan. So use Pathfinder. It's a great tool. And it is a great way for you to understand the climate impacts. The first time my students used this, they came back and they said, I had no idea the decisions I was making are doing this. And so it's my intention in the book to help you understand that, but also the climate, or the Pathfinder calculator can help you understand that. So I'd like to leave you with a challenge. And this is a challenge to make one decision on your studio projects or in your practice to do one thing on a project. Because if you think about just doing a climate positive project, that's pretty overwhelming. Just one thing, use less cement in the concrete mix, et cetera. Whoops, sorry about that. You know, do one of these things and see how it goes, reflect on it. And I'd like to hear your lessons learned on this. But I really feel strongly that now is the time to substantially reduce our carbon footprint. And I look forward to seeing your low carbon work in the future. And I look forward to this new crop of students who are going to come out and make some substantive changes in our profession. So thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Thanks.
Fantastic. I want to give you a
Thank you.
medallion. It's Ed Stone there. So we'll just
That's lovely. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for being here and your interest in this topic. Are there any questions?
Hello.
Hello?
So first off, thank you so much for this. This is absolutely wonderful. When you met us for lunch earlier, I think it was Michael who mentioned that there's so much discussion of like resiliency in landscape architecture, but less about like getting in front of the issue, right? And actually reducing our emissions actively. So first off, there's that. Second, you mentioned the process of like with the parking lots, the circle saws cutting out the little sections, and I think you mentioned that was a temporary park. Uh,
Yeah.
I've thought about that before. As we move away from car-centric infrastructure, hopefully a lot of our parking lots will get converted into public spaces.
Yes.
But when you're doing that process of cutting through the parking lot, this might be getting into the weeds. Let me know if that's too much. But I've thought about like you have like cross slopes with your your pathways that you're typically doing that would be different than the parking lot itself. Is there much of an issue with drainage? Like how would you address drainage when it comes to cutting out all these pathways?
Yeah.
Because the cross slopes might not be calculated right.
Right, the cross slopes might not be counted. That's a good question. I had never thought of that. And it's not one of my projects. It's a wagon landscaping project. But I would say that it is a temporary project. And the reason that it's temporary is there are plans to build a building there, but not for like a decade. And so they said, well, nobody's going to pay to build a park that's only going to last for 10 years, but we can make it a park rather than just an abandoned parking lot. So that's why they did it. But I think with all of the planting in between, I don't think drainage is going to be an issue with cross slopes that maybe aren't perfect, and accessibility is probably not going to be an issue as well either. But it is interesting to think about how they built it, because when you look closely, I didn't show the picture, but you know how when you're saw cutting something, like in order to get to the very edge of a cut, you have to cut a little, the round blade goes a little bit further. And so it's full of little details like that, I don't know, I kind of like to geek out over that kind of thing, but it's a really compelling project. Good question.
So, one thing I love about Aldi is that they don't give you plastic bags.
Uh-huh.
And when you take away the easy option, people learn to do without.
Yeah.
When our clients might be big developers that are used to having brand new materials and easy, basic concrete parking lots, they might have a hard time
Mhm.
transitioning into these alternate materials. How do we learn to say no when budget might be a limitation or legislation allows these easy but harmful options?
Right. It's hard because the client hired you. They're paying you for the work. And so some landscape architects that I've talked to have said, "Well, we're only going to work with certain clients." But that doesn't really work on a widespread basis. That's kind of some firms can do that. Other firms need to make money. So I feel like we need to right, yeah, we need to have substantive change, and I've been saying we need to have change for 25 years, and things have changed. Not just because I've been saying it, for a lot of reasons things have changed, but we need to just always move the needle a little bit. I'm an incrementalist. I feel like I say, we're always going to use concrete, right? Someday we might not be using Portland cement concrete. We might be using some alternative cement concrete. Things do change, but we just have to push a little bit. And we have to do the work on some projects where we can, and then show that work and the success of that to other clients. I think that's the only way things are going to change. But I like that our profession is embracing this, because when our profession embraces it, change will happen. And I think, yeah, just keep pushing forward. Get people used to using, and for the concrete changes, it's going to be talking to engineers and getting engineers to adjust their standard specs. But it also might be using performance specs instead of prescriptive specs. So if you say, we are asking this, we want this concrete to have a 30% lower carbon footprint, the ready mix company can then figure out how to do that. They can use cement substitutes, they can use lower PSI if it's still going to be strong enough. They can tailor make a series of solutions that they're comfortable with, instead of us saying you have to use 40% class F fly ash, etc. Yeah.
Hi. Could you elaborate on the life cycle of carbon sequestration? Because it's like this sequesters this much carbon, and this will have all of this, and this total net is this. But that carbon's only sequestered for the lifespan,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
then it gets re-released. So what's the long-term conceptualization of, and how do those numbers work?
Well, okay, so you hit the nail on the head when it comes to this being kind of a controversial practice of counting carbon stored. Because no matter what kind of lumber you're using, eventually it's going to decompose or it's going to burn first. And all that carbon that's stored in it is going to be released. And so if you look at the full life cycle of wood lumber, it is carbon neutral, right? It stores all this carbon, but then it eventually releases it and it gets to zero. And it's really not carbon neutral because we expend a lot of energy trucking it, processing it, debarking it, planing it, etc. So that's the argument that a lot of folks in this industry, in the life cycle assessment industry, are using to say we really can't call wood carbon neutral. We still can say it stores carbon up to a certain point. And the USDA actually has made the argument that if you plant trees immediately after you harvest other trees for lumber, you could actually be carbon positive because you end up planting more trees while still storing some of the carbon in another application. So it's a really complicated discussion, but you have identified the problems with it.
Is there really sequestering carbon? Because we've put ourselves at such an overshoot that we need to make up for, but then whatever is sequestered will like always eventually be re-released. Like, how could we get into like ahead of the overshoot by overshooting sequestering do you know what I mean?
I know what you're saying.
I don't know
and
how
I
it's
don't have an
working out.
answer. I'm sorry. It's really complicated, right, when we start thinking about sequestering and storing carbon. I think the biggest, so to get to climate positive, what we really need to do is we need to stop making new materials. We need to reuse what we've already made over and over and over again. We need to build less. We need to build smaller. And I tell some of my students that, and they're like, with their design projects, they're like, well, we're not doing anything because we don't, I'm like, no, this is design school. You have to do a project. But don't do that. But really, we do need to scale way back. We can't treat our built environment as just new and shiny, new and shiny, new and shiny all the time. And that's really going to get us closer to climate positive than planting 1,000 trees that are going to sequester carbon that we've expended to make the materials.
Hello.
Hi.
I was curious if you think that with our current government, it'll be a little bit harder for public projects to market themselves as climate positive.
Yes. Yes. So the Inflation Reduction Act, which I hate that they call it that, but I get why they call it that, is really a lot about climate change and sort of slowing us and turning the ship. And there's a lot in the Inflation Reduction Act incentivizing reducing the embodied carbon of construction materials, particularly with roadway construction, because obviously roadway construction uses a lot of material. A lot of DOTs are incentivized to reduce the carbon footprint of their new roads and their existing roads. And I am terrified that all of that's going to go away because it's only been in place for a couple years. It has already substantially transformed the industry, and I'm terrified that it's going to be taken away. So yeah. Other question?
Hi, my name is Hannah.
Hi.
I'm a second year LA student. I had a question regarding the cement that you had mentioned earlier with the earth blocks. I was wondering if there was what deterioration looked like over time for them, and what is it like? What's the relation into the deterioration over time over durability and compared to others?
Yeah. So compressed earth block, if I only had another week to talk with you, I would tell you everything in the book. But I do have a chapter in the book on earth-based construction. And, for millennia, most of the world lived in earth-based constructions. And then all of a sudden it became thought of as kind of a third world, not a desirable thing to live in an earthen building. But the technologies are there, and they're enjoying a resurgence in Europe. And the UN, because we have this rapidly growing population, the UN has really focused on earth-based construction methods like compressed earth block as a viable alternative to provide housing for people in locations that are remote, where we can't get CMUs, concrete masonry units, into these locations. We can get the compressed earth block machine, which is a portable machine about the size of this podium. We can drag that in on the back of a truck, use local soil, bring in a couple bags of cement, and make compressed earth block that functions very much like CMUs. And in drier climates, they don't need to be stabilized at all. In fact, cement isn't even used sometimes. In moist climates, like in Gainesville, if we built a compressed earth block wall, we would put stucco on it so that it weatherproofs it a little bit. Although it does need to breathe, it needs to maintain a certain level of moisture to perform adequately, but it can be used anywhere. It's just not in our arsenal. Like if you go to a contractor and you say, I want to do compressed earth block wall, they'll be like, what? I am not your person. But little by little, it is gaining traction. And in some of the most compelling buildings in Europe are now earth-based. So they're not compressed earth block, they're rammed earth. But but it is enjoying a resurgence, and I hope it will make its way to the U.S. in a more widespread manner. Certainly, we have a ton of rammed earth buildings, mostly low-rise buildings, houses in the Southwest and in California. The building codes are accommodating rammed earth and compressed earth block and adobe. And the international building code is also accommodating earth-based construction. So I think stay tuned for that. Nick.
Hey, Meg, I have one last question, and I wanted to follow up on what Daniela was asking about related to changing public policy, because obviously public policy is changing now, but I do wonder if there's kind of a hint of hope, in the sense that a lot of the practices you were talking about relate to more labor happening on site, particularly with the increasingly protectionist policy, economic policy that we're heading towards. A lot of these sites and these methods require new skills and new jobs that would have to be
Yes.
created. Have there been any calculations similar to like what you showed us with regard to, in addition to decreasing costs, but also increasing employment locally to implement some of these that could be attractive to a protectionist economy?
Oh, that's a tough question. I'm not aware of any studies. The cost of labor in the U.S. is expensive. So earth-based construction in a country that would be considered a developing country is doable, because oftentimes you have more labor, less expensive labor, and more people willing to help build something, community members or people that can give extra time as volunteers to building something. If we tried to make compressed earth blocks, if our contractors were asked to make those and then use them and construct with them, that would be prohibitively expensive. So from that standpoint, I'm not sure we can make the argument for some of these alternative structures. However, the place we can make the argument is with hauling costs. And has anybody ever added up how much it costs to take down a building and haul it away to a landfill, especially when you have tipping fees that are getting higher and higher and higher all the time because we're trying to discourage landfilling our waste? That is expensive. That can really add quite a bit to the cost of a project. And so if we can reuse a lot of these things on site, there's that economic benefit. The other economic benefit is, there's been this argument, well, we can't get rid of the coal industry, we can't get rid of natural gas, because those are, and petroleum, those are employing so many people. But there has been study after study recently about how the renewables industry also employs a tremendous amount of people, and you might argue that it's a slightly more skilled workforce. So in that respect, you can make that argument, and I am stunned every day that that argument is not more prevalent in our news media.
Thank you so much, and we're so grateful that you are here tonight.
Thank you. Happy to be here. You're welcome. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
And hi, my name is Lily Crawford, and I'm the president of the student chapter, and we just want to give a big thank you to our department for hosting the Ed Stone lecture series, but then also Meg Calkins for being here tonight with us. It's always a wonderful opportunity to have wonderful professionals in the room. And then also with that, we're pulling up some QR codes if anybody would like to donate and give more students an opportunity like Jordan got to present and travel and really just have impacts like this on our profession. And then we also invite you to come follow out in the room out there to have a reception and to follow with Compound, and we really thank them for being here and working with our department to have such a wonderful social before our industry expo. So let's join outside. Thank you.